What if the most important hands that built America's future were erased from the nation's memory? What if entire communities who carved their names into mountains, tunneled through rock, and laid the tracks that connected the East to the West were deliberately written out of the story? Tonight, we dive into one of the greatest untold chapters of American history. The Chinese railroad workers, the backbone of the Transcontinental Railroad, who shaped America's destiny, only to be forgotten by the very nation they helped build. The 1850s and 60s were a time when America's destiny seemed to stretch endlessly westward, but reality was far harsher than the dream. The discovery of gold in California had lured thousands across oceans and prairies, but getting there was no easy feat. Imagine the choices: 6 months on a wagon train across hostile plains, mountains and deserts, where food might run out and illness could spread like fire. Or months on a ship around Cape Horn, where storms could tear vessels apart and leave passengers starving. Or the shortcut through Panama, which was shorter but came with the risk of malaria, yellow fever, and treachery. The journey itself was a gamble with life. Politicians, merchants, and settlers alike began to say the same thing: there must be a faster way. A railroad stretching from one end of the country to the other was no longer a fantasy, it was becoming a national obsession. Imagine what it would mean. Mail delivered in days instead of weeks, goods moving swiftly, armies able to cross the continent, and settlers arriving to claim land before rivals could. The railroad was not just about transportation, it was about power, expansion, and control. But the obstacles were immense. The Sierra Nevada mountains were a wall of granite. The Great Plains stretched endlessly, with few sources of water. The deserts of Utah and Nevada burned with heat by day and froze at night. It was one thing to dream of rails stretching from ocean to ocean, and quite another to hammer spikes into the bones of the earth. Still, in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act, authorizing 2 great companies to take on the task: the Union Pacific, which would begin in the east, and the Central Pacific, which would begin in the west. They were promised government support, loans, and land grants. What they needed now was labor, tens of thousands of men willing to risk their lives to make a dream real. But as they soon discovered, finding such labor would be far more difficult than they imagined. At first, the Central Pacific Railroad turned to the sources most familiar to them. They hired white settlers, hoping the promise of steady wages would attract men eager to work. But the conditions were too harsh, and the pay too little. Many who came walked away after a few weeks. Some fled to the goldfields, where the hope of striking it rich seemed better than freezing to death in a mountain camp. Others quit because the danger was simply too high. Rock slides, explosions, avalanches, these were not the conditions most men willingly endured for $1 a day. The Central Pacific executives, wealthy men like Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, later known as the Big Four, faced a crisis. Their project was stalling, their profits slipping away, their government loans at risk. They needed a solution, and they found it in a community many Americans at the time dismissed and despised: Chinese immigrants. By the 1850s, thousands of men from Guangdong province in southern China had arrived in California. War, famine, and crushing poverty had driven them from their homeland. They came with dreams of Gold Mountain, the mythical land of opportunity. Some found fortune, but many found only discrimination. They were barred from testifying in court, forced into menial labor, and targeted by racist mobs. Yet they endured, taking whatever work they could find, in laundries, on farms, and in the service trades that white workers scorned. The Central Pacific executives were skeptical. They doubted whether Chinese workers could handle the grueling physical demands of railroad construction. In their own words, they considered them weak and effeminate. But one of the executives, Charles Crocker, insisted on giving them a trial. 50 Chinese workers were hired and put to work beside white crews. To the astonishment of the overseers, the Chinese workers proved not only capable, but superior. They labored longer hours, kept discipline, and accomplished more in less time. Crocker immediately ordered more. Recruitment expanded. Agents were sent to San Francisco's Chinatown, offering contracts. Soon, thousands signed on. By 1865, Chinese laborers were the majority of the Central Pacific workforce. At the height of construction, there were more than 15,000 Chinese men working on the line, about 90% of the workforce. Their numbers transformed the project from a stalled dream into a surging reality. But the terms were harsh. They were paid less than white workers, sometimes a third less. They had to provide their own food, their own tents, their own clothing. They worked 6 days a week, dawn to dusk. Yet the Chinese came, because even this exploitation offered more than the poverty they had fled, and because for many, the railroad was a stepping stone towards sending money home or building new lives in America. They were the hidden engine of progress, driving the railroad forward mile by mile. The Sierra Nevada mountains became the crucible in which the Chinese workers proved themselves. The mountains were beautiful, yes, but they were also merciless. Sheer cliffs blocked the way. Granite rock defied picks and shovels. Winter storms buried men alive. And yet the railroad had to go through. The Chinese workers blasted tunnels through solid rock. In some cases, they advanced only a foot a day. They used black powder and later nitroglycerin, a dangerous substance so volatile it could explode from a simple jolt. To plant charges, men were lowered in baskets down vertical cliffs, swinging in the wind, carrying explosives. Imagine the courage it took to hang hundreds of feet above the ground with only a rope keeping you alive, knowing that one mistake would mean instant death. Many never came back. In winter, the snow came, sometimes 20, 30, even 40 feet deep. Entire work camps disappeared under avalanches. Men built tunnels not just for trains, but for themselves, digging passageways under the snow from tent to tent. Fires burned day and night, but frostbite was common, and starvation always loomed. In one terrible winter alone, dozens were swept away by snowslides. Their bodies were never recovered. The daily routine was no easier in summer. Heat beat down on the desert stretches, water scarce and rationed. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Injuries were constant. Crushed hands, broken limbs, blindness from explosions. And yet they labored on. Their progress was measured in inches and miles, in scars and in bones. We do not know how many Chinese workers died during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Records were rarely kept. Some historians estimate 1,000, others several thousand. Their names were seldom written down. Their graves were unmarked. In the official records, their deaths were not counted, as if their lives weighed nothing in the balance of history. But without them, the Central Pacific would never have carved its way through the mountains. Without them, the Transcontinental Railroad would have failed. In the camps, life was harsh, but the Chinese workers built community. Unlike the Irish and white workers who relied on salted meat and whiskey, the Chinese imported rice, dried vegetables, and tea from home. They cooked stir-fries, soups, and meals that gave them strength. Their diet, healthier than most, kept them alive in conditions that killed others. They lived in tents or rough wooden shacks, sometimes moving entire camps as the line advanced. But there was also isolation. White workers often shunned them, mocked their language and customs, and treated them as outsiders. The railroad bosses segregated them, paying them less and forcing them to supply their own tools. Yet within their camps, the Chinese maintained order. They organized work teams, helped one another, and shared what little they had. Some brought musical instruments, others practiced traditional medicine. Even in exile, they carried pieces of home, and they did not suffer silently. In June 1867, thousands of Chinese workers launched a strike, the largest in America at the time. They demanded better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. They stopped working, and for a week, the Central Pacific ground to a halt. The company responded with cruelty. They cut off food deliveries to the camps. They blocked supplies. They tried to starve the workers into submission. After a week, with no food and no support from the outside world, the workers returned to their jobs. Their demands were not met. But the strike was a powerful statement. In a time when Chinese immigrants had no political power, no legal rights, and faced open hostility, they dared to resist. Their courage echoed in silence, for decades, unremembered by the history books. May 10th, 1869. Promontory Summit, Utah. The dream was realized. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific met, their rails joined. The ceremonial golden spike was driven into the final tie, a symbol of triumph. Across the nation, church bells rang, cannons fired, people cheered. The Transcontinental Railroad was hailed as the greatest achievement of the age. The famous photograph was taken that day, two locomotives facing each other, white workers and executives gathered around, champagne bottles raised, hammers lifted in victory. That photograph became the icon of the railroad, printed in newspapers, textbooks, and history books for generations. But if you look at it closely, something is missing. Not one Chinese face is in the frame. And yet who had done most of the work for the Central Pacific? Who had laid the tracks, dug the tunnels, blasted the rock, carried the rails, and built the bridges? It was the Chinese. Some were even present at Promontory Summit, but they were ordered to stand aside, excluded from the photograph, left out of the speeches. Their absence was deliberate. America wanted the railroad, but not the story of the men who had built it. The image of triumph was a lie of omission. The true builders were invisible. When the railroad was done, the Chinese workers scattered. Some stayed with the railroad, hired for maintenance or other lines. Others moved into farming, leasing land and growing crops. Many opened laundries, groceries, restaurants, and small businesses. They built Chinatowns across the West, vibrant communities of survival and culture. But their welcome was not celebration, it was violence. White workers resented them as competitors. Politicians demonized them as a yellow peril. Newspapers filled with racist caricatures. Mobs attacked Chinatowns, burning homes and businesses. In 1871, in Los Angeles, a mob lynched 18 Chinese men in a single night. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, in 1885, miners massacred Chinese laborers, driving survivors out of town. Across the West, violence and exclusion spread. The government responded not with protection, but with punishment. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. the first major U.S. law to ban immigration based on race. It barred Chinese laborers from entering the country. It denied citizenship to those already here. Families were torn apart. Men who had built the railroad were trapped as outsiders, denied the right to belong to the very nation they had helped unite. For decades, Chinese immigrants lived under a cloud of fear and exclusion, their role in America erased, their sacrifices forgotten. For more than a century, the story of the Chinese railroad workers was absent from the history taught in schools. The Transcontinental Railroad was remembered as a triumph of American progress, but the men who had made it possible were erased. Generations grew up never knowing their names, their faces, their sacrifices. They became ghosts along the tracks, buried under silence. But silence does not last forever. Descendants, historians, and archaeologists began to ask questions. They searched old company records, uncovered payrolls, and found traces of forgotten lives. Archaeological digs at old camps revealed bowls, chopsticks, medicine bottles, tools, remnants of daily life that told a story the history books had ignored. Families passed down oral traditions, stories of ancestors who had come from Guangdong, who had built the railroad, who had endured but were never honored. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. Today, monuments and ceremonies increasingly recognize the Chinese railroad workers. At the 150th anniversary in 2019, descendants stood at Promontory Summit, reclaiming the story. At last, the faces that had been missing from the photograph began to reappear in memory. And yet, the question lingers. Why were they erased in the first place? What does it say about America that the very hands that built its backbone were written out of its story? When we tell the story of America, we must tell it whole. We must remember not just the tycoons and the politicians, but the workers, the immigrants, the marginalized, whose sweat and blood made progress possible. So the next time you see a train rushing across the land, think of the men who blasted mountains, tunneled through granite, and laid rails mile after mile. They were not faceless. They were not invisible. They were the builders of a nation. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.